Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. We have been on hiatus, but we are back. It is 2017. America is great, or at the very least, Blogging Heads is great. I'm Heather Hurlburt. I run the New Models of Policy Change Project at New America.
And I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I also write spoiler alerts for the Washington Post.
And Dan, I feel like we should note at the beginning of this that of good things that have happened in 2017, we are getting to have a lot of colleagues in the national security foreign policy podcast space. And so we make a hearty welcome to all of our colleagues in that space. And we just will note that you and I have been doing this podcast since before there were podcasts.
When the History Channel does the exhaustive 6-hour documentary on the history of foreign policy podcasts, we will be in the first hour.
It will feature us in funny hats.
Exactly.
So
in like doggerel type, like the where we have the poses like that,
In case you are tuning into this podcast because you think there is nothing good happening in American foreign and national security policy, Drezner and I are here to tell you that you're wrong.
Yes.
Well, now that we're done with the good news.
Right. That's true. If nothing else, the proliferation of foreign policy podcasts is a good thing. But that said, we are speaking literally a week, almost to the exact minute, a week after Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 45th president of the United States. And, frankly, it's been a really boring first week. Not a lot has happened. Maybe a few things have happened. Yeah,
we had a little trouble before we came on the air, sort of parsing out what we were going to talk about. Zerlina Maxwell tweeted this morning that this, she thought, had been the worst week in American history, which made me go back and look at 1861. And
definitely not the worst week in American
history. When you're comparing your week to 1861, that's I think we can say from a political scientist professional perspective, that's not a good sign.
Right. Or, speaking about international relations, people have been talking about whether this is the worst year or 2016 was the worst year since, let's say, 1968. And I think 1968 was actually worse, but that said, that you're even having the conversation is somewhat problematic.
Well, I am just going to pause and say that I'm very partial to 1968.
As am I.
I thought we might be equally partial to 1968.
Exactly, yes.
So.
But that said, I do think, in fairness, that a number of sort of journalists and others who, while not necessarily supportive of Trump, are not full-blown, never Trumpers, I think have raised at least a somewhat valid point in suggesting that maybe there have been areas where either the mainstream media or the foreign policy community has overreacted to certain stories that have come out. And that, in fact, a lot of what has happened in this first week is a lot of what happens in any administration's first week. And that, to be fair, there are times where you need to parse out what is going on is unique to this administration in a really bad way, or is it just stuff that happens and we're overreacting? So, as a result, this entire podcast is dedicated to the theme of the first week of Trump, are we overreacting or underreacting? And I believe our plan is to go through a series of issues related to the foreign policy and national security windows and decide whether or not we think people are overreacting or underreacting to what Trump and his staff are doing.
And I also want to just add to that it is possible that something may have a large effect on a large number of people, and yet it would still be the case that you people are either over or underreacting, because what you and I are doing here is bringing an institutional lens.
Right.
Did whatever the development, for example, did Donald Trump putting out a statement on Holocaust Remembrance Day that makes no reference to Jews? That seems odd and possibly emblematic of other things. It is, on the one hand, it's not a big deal because it's a statement on an anniversary, and that's not a big deal. It has no policy implications for anything. On the other hand, it is a dramatic break with sort of classic political practice.
Or there's the obverse, which are policies that do have a significant impact because Trump has been inaugurated, but in point of fact are not really a departure from previous Republican administrations. So
global gag rule.
The Mexico City policy was what I was. Yes, exactly. That would be a classic example. Yeah. So Trump is sworn in. He implements the Mexico City policy. I understand a great number of liberals are going to have a great number of people are going to have issues with that. But let's be honest. That is, since I believe Reagan on, something that every Republican president imposes and something that every Democratic president removes.
I will also note that unlike some of the other areas we're going to talk about, the global gag rule order was carefully written in a way that actually extends it to more areas of assistance than has been in the case in the past, which is an interesting theme that will thread through this conversation, is that some of these policy areas were prepared clearly by people who know the area well and who've been thinking for many years about how they want to change the policy. Others appear to have been prepared by people who read fake news sites and are not particularly well acquainted with the fact patterns associated with the issues in question.
So let's start off with that, because I bet what you're talking about is the proposal to reduce U.S. contributions to various international organizations.
Well, and to some of the specifics within it, being that the U.S. should reduce contributions to organizations that recognize Palestine. Hint, we don't contribute anything to any organizations that currently recognize Palestine. And that the U.S. should withdraw from participating in several international treaties, chiefly the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which we don't belong to because Congress wouldn't ratify it. So Congress has been effectively protecting the American people from the depredations of eliminating discrimination against women for several decades now.
And the rights of the I can't remember.
No, that's another one on the list.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the interesting point here is that executive order, which supposedly was not shown to our new ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, in advance. It clearly did not have the benefit of the expertise of anybody in the State Department who knows anything about what treaties we adhere to and which ones we didn't, or what UN bodies we support and what ones we didn't.
Okay, so this gives rise to another question, overreact or underreact, which is events that happened yesterday. Namely, there was a story by Josh Rogan, I believe, who originally broke this in the Washington Post, in which he announced that 4 State Department senior management officials that generally are in charge of running the building, as it were. They don't have policy bailiwicks. They literally are in charge of staff, the management positions. It turns out, the reporting originally suggested they had all resigned. It now appears that what happened was they submitted their resignations as per standard for January 20th. Apparently, originally they were accepted in the sense of you will resign effective immediately January 20th at noon. It has now been changed. They then altered that, and it turns out they were all told you should step down, which was announced yesterday. This led to a whole bunch, at least on social media, of sort of reactions to this, including, however, I believe a statement from the American Foreign Service Association at the end of the day suggesting that this really wasn't as big of a deal as some on social media were making it to be. So, overreact or underreact?
You put together the executive order and the departures and the fact that Tillerson got voted out of committee on a party line vote, which is the first time that has ever happened to a Secretary of State. He's on track to get confirmed with less. Secretaries of State get I believe only 7 people voted against Kissinger. Is that right? Kissinger was one. No, it's got to have been maybe 13. But Kissinger was one of the more contentious state appointments in modern times, and he got more than 70 votes.
Hillary Clinton sailed through as Secretary of State.
That's an excellent point you make there. So sort of overall, the overall point that I think you should draw from this is that the people who do and follow most closely American diplomacy don't think they're getting minimally competent American diplomacy, not because of Tillerson personally, I hasten to add, but because of the sort of net. The net of what you get here is, yes, this is a big deal. Any individual piece of it, not that big a deal.
Right. But
on net, this is a very, very large deal in terms of how do you get anything done for the U.S. in the world.
The thing I'm actually genuinely flummoxed about, to be fair, I think, first of all, it should be stressed that what happened was entirely legal and sort of par for the court. The general rule, and Heather, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, obviously all senior, sort of political appointees resign, and effective January 20th. Usually there are a few people that are asked to stay on sort of as caretakers until undersecretaries and or deputy secretaries, people who know the building, are actually confirmed by the Senate. It strikes me that what is unusual in this situation is that I don't think anyone has been asked to stay on.
Well, more than that is that the 4 people who left yesterday were actually not political appointees. They were career Foreign Service officers, some of them serving in positions, where, the Obama administration put them. An example is that there have been several administrations in recent memory that had career Foreign Service officers as the spokesman. So Nick Burns, Richard Boucher, if you go further back in the day. And, obviously a new administration, a new secretary didn't want the spokesperson who was the spokesperson for his or her predecessor from the other party, but the person, chose to get another assignment in the Foreign Service. And, where these individuals yesterday, the reporting was they had sort of been waiting to see, would they go on and take another post, and they all for either chose or were pushed to depart. So that's where, and they were in, and I think, this is where I come back to my basic point about why this is a big deal. Their job is to make the trains run on time, those jobs. And so if they're concluding, either they're concluding we cannot make this place function given what we've, given that someone is coming in and sign and proclamating executive orders about how the State Department functions, clearly based on no input from anyone who actually understands how the State Department functions. Mm-hmm. So either they're looking at that and concluding, whoa, we can't do our jobs, or, and I'll remind you that we still don't have a deputy secretary nominee, apparently because there isn't agreement between the Trump people and Tillerson on who would be acceptable. So you basically
rumors,
have.
I just want to make sure the rumors are the same that you've heard. I've heard the names that I've heard floated recently were Elliot Abrams and Paula Dobryansky.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Same ones I've heard.
Right.
But those have been floating around for a couple weeks, and there's been no announcement. And so I'm at the point that many of those rumors I think are sort of wishful thinking, frankly, from people that both you and I know.
Right.
But what you have is the political transition people who are perfectly fine with not having anybody there who can actually, carry out the basic functions of American diplomacy. And that, folks, is not what Trump voters voted for. Nobody was interested in, let's not have a State Department.
Well, yes and no. Now let me. I don't want to push back exactly, but I want to suggest 2 things that are going on here. The first is that from a bureaucratic politics perspective, it is not terribly surprising to me that you're seeing the White House staff trying to get out in front with these series of executive orders, particularly with respect to foreign policy, because again, it's worth remembering, during all of the Senate confirmation hearings, not just Secretary of Defense Mattis, but also, Tillerson and others, made statements that were actually pretty much at odds with what Trump's foreign policy rhetoric had been during the campaign. And if you're someone like, I don't know, I'll just throw out a name, Steve Bannon, who's in the White House, who legitimately believes in the sort of populist nationalism that Trump has been talking about, it's not entirely surprising to me that they are pushing what they are pushing now because they recognize that once state and defense are actually staffed up, and staffed up with people that presumably, at least at a minimum, are signed off on by Tillerson and Mattis, hey, they're going to get some bureaucratic blowback. They're going to get significant pushback. So I would say that's not a bug. That's a feature of how Bannon is going forward. And if Bannon legitimately believes that that's what got Trump the electoral victory, then I can see that. This leads to the second point I would make, which is sort of on a general sort of stepping back, this question of the executive orders that have been promulgated on things like the wall, on immigration, on what have you, and ones that have been mooted somewhat, like the one on vote fraud and the one on potentially black sites. It strikes me that this is one where I'm not sure if there's an overreaction or underreaction, because on the one hand, some of what's being proposed is clearly pretty appalling, particularly the black sites, the idea of bringing back waterboarding and torture, and something that Trump said he thought worked in his truly appalling interview with ABC. But that said, there's two counters to that, which is first, among other things, the Black Site memo didn't get signed, which suggests there actually was pushback, which means that maybe the system might be working a little better than we thought. And second, a lot of these executive orders seem really badly worded or badly structured in such a way that, like the one on the wall, as I read it, the key sentence was, the federal government will allocate available resources towards this, which I don't think are all that much. So, is this a case where people are reacting to the rhetoric in the executive orders without understanding what's actually being said?
Well, I do think part of the strategy of the executive orders is that if you issue an executive order, then to some extent you can tell your base that you did the thing.
Right, exactly.
So I do think there's a lot of checking of boxes. But I also think that there's been a certain amount of complacency, having observed that, for example, the wall executive order is not self-executing. That, issuing that order is not going to result in the building of a wall.
Right.
But I think it's important to go through the national security ones, so the black sites and torture, which it's important to note those are two different points. One is reopening or re-permitting, and just to be clear to folks who haven't had the pleasure of following this, black sites are detention centers that are off of U.S. soil and are not acknowledged. And so therefore, number one, there are certain rights that it has been contested in courts that detainees have if being held on U.S. territory, even if being held by the military, and that they do not have if being held not on U.S. territory. So that's already concerning. And then point two is obviously, by definition, if they're a black site, we don't know where they are. And they may very well be located in countries that don't have domestic protections and or don't enforce what domestic protections and what protections international law affords to anybody that you take prisoner anywhere under any circumstances. So that's sort of a whole category of thing. And I do think, that one, there are people, in the defense community who really didn't like and who saw it as a significant problem, not having a place you could snatch people and then interrogate them. And interestingly, something that makes this complicated to think about from a liberal perspective is the argument was we were killing people because we didn't have any place to take them and interrogate them. So this is a challenging issue. I would argue it's not really a sort of throwing out an executive order that says, oh, hey, let's just start up some cool black site detention centers, suggests to me that you haven't really had a thoughtful internal debate about what to do. But there are people who've been having this debate. Now, on the other hand, the torture piece of it was interesting because, of course, there is plenty of U.S. law against torture. So you cannot reinstate torture with an executive order. And somebody clearly knew that. So, which is where you get this, well, we're going to look at interrogation methods again. Mm-hmm. So again, those orders, you do have some people who know something about defense working on them. And that suggests to me that we need to take very seriously that there are people inside who have those views and who have some experience working in the institutions.
Okay. And I would add, by the way, that it struck me that those were what I did find interesting was those were the orders, the at least floated executive orders that I think got the biggest amount of congressional pushback, not just from Democrats, but from Republicans. And those are the ones that generated a fair amount of press stories suggesting that neither Mattis nor Pompeo had signed off on it or had even been in the loop on any of these things, which again is consistent with some of this, the story that I was talking about before, about the White House pushing out things that cabinet officials don't necessarily know all that much about. So what would you like? I've been giving out examples of overreaction and underreaction. Do you have any that you would?
Right. Well, the one that we haven't talked about yet, which I think has been underreacted to from the national security community, is the immigration and refugee executive order. Because that one, it's very clear that is already having effect. Right. So State Department officers who are in charge of refugee processing were told to stop processing and to cancel their interviews with refugee applicants. Mm-hmm. So that one, is having a real life impact on real life human beings today as we speak, number one. Number two, the immigration piece of it, you saw an immediate reaction from right-wing groups saying, oh, great, this means that law enforcement can pick up anybody and deport them. And that, while not in fact literally true, that has, to me, that's one where the rhetoric matters a lot. Because if that executive order has the intent and the effect of empowering a sort of vigilante sense in American culture, that's going to have a lot of very, very negative effects on people. And then just the last thing I want to say is the catastrophic signal it sends to people who are our partners and allies, both in terms of, you're an Iraqi translator, you fought alongside us, yeah. You've been, your family is very frightened because people would like to kill them because you worked for us and you applied for refugee status and now you are stuck. Or you are an American soldier of Iraqi descent. Read about a guy like this online yesterday, interestingly, in a story tweeted out by the Defense Department, which might indeed suggest that some people are very much not in line. So you're an Iraqi American soldier. You are in northern Iraq fighting for your family members. Your family members can't come to the U.S. to visit you to say thank you. This is, and then we don't. I mean, you and I both have colleagues who are dual citizens of various kinds who sort of said, "Gee, now if I leave the U.S., I can't come back." So that executive order to me is the one that had the most immediate day-to-day relevance, but that also has long-term national security ramifications that I think, our community, we get so excited talking about sort of making fun of the treaties one, or sort of talking about the ramifications of the black sites one, but the refugee and immigration one might be the one that actually has the most immediate impact.
So let me now articulate, and this is probably, let me put it this way, on the one hand I agree with you that I think there's been an underreaction to it. Let me now articulate to you my worst fears as a result of this executive order, which is actually part of a larger piece of what I wonder if the Trump White House hopes that will happen, which is to say that these are the kinds of orders that will generate, I mean, let's face it, they're a dream for organizations like ISIS, which want to recruit anti-American radicals and lone wolf terrorists as much as possible. Pursuing these kinds of actions is very likely to inspire or radicalize people that would otherwise not necessarily or only somewhat modestly inclined to engage in acts of terrorism in the United States. As a result, you then create a vicious feedback loop, which is to say this will inspire further acts of violence within the United States, further protest movements that could potentially also turn violent, which will then be used as a pretext by the Trump administration to, as I believe he put it in a tweet with respect to Chicago, send the feds in. which is to say it essentially is a way in which Trump can promote his law and order campaign in ways that will further curtail the civil liberties of all American citizens. And there's a part of me that even saying this makes me wonder if I'm being paranoid in saying it, that this will not actually happen. And yet, there's also a part of me that cannot dismiss this out of hand and thinks this is actually the conscious strategy of this White House.
Well, it points to a larger commonality behind all of these orders that we're talking about, which is that they all sort of appear to be things that aren't closely connected to day-to-day American life, and yet it turns out that the things that wonks like you and I think of as the pillars of the liberal international order are actually very closely tied to the pillars of constitutional American order. And now this is where I sort of get to feel all paranoid sounding, but there are ways that each of these orders is using the perceived threat from overseas and the perception that the international liberal order wasn't doing enough for Americans, right, and using that anger and fear as weapons to turn back inward against our order at home. And I'll give you one more specific example, just because it's something that I think has not been sufficiently understood. I was not clear whether it wound up in the final order, but there was conversation that one of the facets of the refugee and immigration order was going to be naming the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization. And, for most Americans who quite understandably don't keep track of their Middle Eastern groups, or, who sort of just don't ever think about that, you're like, well, okay, if they're trying to kill us, sure. And like, geez, I have to trust that somebody knows who's trying to kill us. And it might not seem like that big a deal one way or the other. But there are a non-trivial number of American Muslims who are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, or who have been in some way connected to it, or who have given to charitable organizations connected with it in a totally non-violent, non-terrorist way. And what people are very fearful of is that naming the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization will not only be used, by the way, to help the Egyptian government conduct a very violent and totally non-rights respecting crackdown on dissent in its own country, but that it will be then turned inward against mosques in this country, and that it will move toward something that Trump actually said in a campaign speech that seemed so outside the pale of American life that I think most people just didn't even hear it when he said it. But the idea that you would put the American government in the position of deciding who's a good Muslim and could stay here and who's a bad Muslim and could not. And as I say, I mean, Trump gave this...
Actually, if memory serves, I think one person who was actually appalled by that suggestion was Indiana Governor Mike Pence. I believe, in fact, he tweeted out something along the lines of saying, that's nonsense, we won't ever do that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, we'll have to go look that up. I don't know if people were teaching John Dingell how to do Throwback Thursday on Twitter, and he was sort of tweeting out old Trump tweets and saying, am I doing this right? So that's a John Dingell candidate. But I think, one of the things, frankly, that these executive orders appear to be setting up is a circumstance where you are moving toward a situation where the U.S. government can decide who's a good Muslim and who's a bad Muslim. And that, you can disagree with me on every aspect of foreign policy. You can hate the liberal international order. You can be left or right. But there really, in my opinion, there are not two points of view on the question of whether the U.S. government gets to judge who's a good or bad adherent of a religion, or indeed what a religion is. I mean, Congress shall make no law means yes. Congress shall make no law. So I think that the extent to which these security issues are being swung at the heart of American democracy is the big sort of underreact from this week.
Let me put it this way. The way I, in some ways, my biggest underreact actually jumps off of a point you made, which is to say that I think one of the guiding assumptions for both Trump voters and I think the Trump White House is the belief that the liberal international order, as we understand it, is somehow literally wreaked American carnage. I mean, to quote from the inaugural address. And that therefore the situation is so bad now that even if you disrupt that liberal international order, so what? What the hell have you got to lose? Things are not going to get worse, right? I mean, they can only get better. This is the logic that Trump and his supporters seem to articulate. Now, to inject some facts here, that's not true at all. But I think it actually points to a bigger blind spot that Trump has demonstrated and his supporters have demonstrated throughout the campaign and I suspect into his administration, which is essentially they can't see, they literally are blind to the benefits that aspects of the liberal international order have brought to the United States, in no small part because I think they take them for granted. And the example I would offer here, again, is NAFTA. Is NAFTA. So yesterday there was a big kerfuffle because the Mexican president canceled his visit to the United States after President Trump basically implied, well, don't come unless you're going to offer to pay for the wall, which was an absurd bargaining position because that was not going to happen. Sean Spicer, I believe, floated a trial balloon of a 20% tax on Mexican imports, although even the way he phrased that was relatively unclear, and then he walked it back. This, I would argue, by the way, is an example of just someone who's in their first week in the job and is, going to bollocks things up. I don't really have a great deal of love for Sean Spicer, but everyone who I've talked about him says he's a professional, and I suspect this is something where, they'll shake out the rust after a week or two. What I am genuinely concerned about, however, is that this has prompted a great debate among economists over what the precise benefits of NAFTA have been to the U.S. economy. And you can read Brad DeLong, who basically makes the case that NAFTA is not the boogeyman that many critics have argued about it. And then on the other side, there is Danny Roderick, who doesn't disagree with Brad on the fact that NAFTA hasn't been a disaster, but basically argues that the distributional impact of NAFTA has been much greater than the sort of net welfare gain. The problem I have with both of these debates is that they are strictly economic and they overlook, in some ways, to my opinion, hands down, the biggest benefit of NAFTA is that Mexico, under NAFTA, orients itself as a North American country that aspires to things like democracy and the rule of law and cooperation with the United States on a whole array of issues, including, by the way, counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism. I am old enough to remember what pre-NAFTA Mexico looked like and what pre-NAFTA Mexican-American relations looked like. And I think the answer can be summed up in the words "not good." That there was not a lot of cooperation south of the border. There was a country that was almost, conditioned its entire identity as opposition to the United States and resentment at U.S. intrusion into Mexican affairs. And the reason I bring this up is that essentially there's going to be an election in Mexico next year, and the leading candidate is Lopez Obrador, who I believe goes by the acronym AMLO. And he's someone who's run twice before. He is from the PRD party. It's a pretty far left party. It's not quite Chavez-like, although Chavez supported him in one of the previous elections. My suggestion is that if this is one of these examples where Trump looks at relations, at NAFTA and the relations with Mexico and thinks, oh my God, we run a $60 billion deficit with them. There are immigrants who occasionally cross the border. This is unacceptable. If you have a Mexico that is under a severe recession and whose government does not really cooperate with the United States, I would suggest that things are going to be a lot worse than a $60 billion trade deficit, which is frankly not all that big of a deal. And so that is my concern, that essentially what is being underreacted to is the fact that the current rules of the game benefit the United States in a much greater way than people realize, because yes, you can point to things where things don't look terribly great, but I remember what they were like before the institutions were set up in the first place, and they were far worse.
So we're trying to have two conversations at once here, I think, which is really challenging. And one is, I actually think the Danny Roderick distributional argument is a good lens on sort of the political and security results of NAFTA as well, in that formalistic government-to-government cooperation in the security realm is you're right, it's not comparable at all to what it was like before. It's light years better. On the other hand, the things that NAFTA was supposed to deliver for Mexican citizens, and in terms of actual sort of progress within Mexico on institution building, have really not been realized, or have not been realized to the extent that Mexican citizens hoped they would be realized, which, as we know from the U.S. context, is maybe much more important than the sort of, what's the word I want, than an absolute scale.
Yeah.
So NAFTA provided big benefits and big disappointments on the sort of security side, political security side as well, and that. Were we living in a different moment, or when we are living in a different moment and we get to thinking about, sort of what do we pull out of the wreckage of what's happening right now, not losing sight of that distributional argument and thinking about, if it were a Clinton administration renegotiating NAFTA rather than a Trump administration, what would you do to try to change the distributional problems both or on all three sides, because there's also some distributional problems on the Canadian side, in the environmental realm, and how would you shift the model for trade agreements? What could you learn to do a little better or a lot better distributionally? So that's one sort of really highly relevant and important conversation. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, we have we have someone lighting dumpster fires along the border, basically. And as much as I profoundly believe that the conversation I just referenced is the one we need to be having, I would like not to see things get a lot worse either for Americans or Mexicans, because, as you note, through a whole bunch of mechanisms, anything that is upsetting on one side and harmful is ultimately going to be upsetting and harmful on the other, which I think, back to our point about institutions, in some ways that's the fundamental point that Trump world rejects. The idea that you can deglobalize, that you could do something that would be good for the U.S. economy, and that it just wouldn't matter what it did to the Mexican economy. Right. And I think the 20% tariff is a great example of that. That this fantasy that you could put on a 20% tariff and that wouldn't have any effect on anybody.
Right. Or the wall, for that matter, is the immigration parallel to this, which is, clearly the Trump administration has made a bet that they can act unilaterally in a way that will please their base and or benefit the U.S. economy, and that would outweigh any gains they could potentially get from multilateral cooperation. I think that doesn't apply just to NAFTA. I think it applies more generally, frankly. That there are a few partners they're going to be looking for. Theresa May, I believe, is in Washington as we speak. There's going to be a weekend call with Vladimir Putin. There are clearly some leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu, where Trump is perfectly happy to be friendly with. There aren't a lot of them, though. To your larger point, I obviously agree with you on the second thing. I would argue that the first one is I would offer two pushbacks to this. The first is that even if you acknowledge Roderick's point about distribution, and I think that's a totally fair empirical point to make, the question becomes whether or not the solutions to that are truly international or whether they're domestic. And I think you can make the case that that's an instance where, in fact, dealing with the dislocations from increased trade is by and large a domestic problem, not an international problem. And this points to this points to a deeper issue that I think explains why there is so much, why there is an eroding trust in both domestic and international institutions, which is you and I are aware that if you negotiate a treaty, or let's say you pass a thing like, I don't know, comprehensive healthcare reform, you're not going to get it right on the first try. There are always going to be, any solution to a problem is going to create more problems. That's just the nature of policymaking. That's the nature of the beast. The way it used to work on this is that when you did that, you would create new problems, and then usually after 3, 4, 5 years, Congress and the president would get together and figure out, okay, we now have these new problems. What are we going to do to fix this? Because that is a problem. Now, would it always be solved? No. Would it always be solved perfectly? God, no. But there was a recognition, usually on both sides of the aisle, that a problem required some kind of solution. And while there would be obviously partisan fights about this and so on and so forth, think like the doc fix in Medicare, for example. That's always the sort of classic example where there was a flaw in the initial legislation and there's a recognition, okay, we're just going to have to deal with this going forward. You can argue that rising levels of partisanship in Congress have essentially made that kind of, every couple of years maintenance of both the domestic and liberal and international orders much more difficult, which means that essentially, in some ways, it's like having a factory where you don't constantly engage in reinvestment, and as a result, capital begins to depreciate rather seriously over time. Machines break down, things stop working. And so I do think that, the criticism that is often levied against institutions like NAFTA or other, international institutions is often, there's at least a small to a large grain of truth to them. The problem is that I think the reason they have not worked terribly well also has something to do with the fact that it has become that much more difficult to fix them or to make minor modifications over time. And therefore, as a result, we're now in the situation that we are.
That's a great theoretical position. I am completely at a loss to name one instance where somebody wanted to address a distributional problem coming out of NAFTA or CAFTA, just to name two, and what blocked them from doing it was partisanship in Congress, as opposed to,
Trade Promotion Authority would have fallen under that category. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Democrats were constantly okay with passing Trade Promotion Authority, let's say under the Bush years, for example, but they wanted expanded amounts of trade adjustment assistance, which the Republicans were never willing to offer.
I gotta say, I would point the finger a little more severely at us, at the security/trade elite on these issues, and say, yes, things got more partisan and more difficult, and we didn't think that fixing the flaws was very high up on our list of priorities.
All right. For the record, I thought these were big flaws, but I grant you that I might have been a sole voice in the wilderness.
Right.
But my point stands, which is this is an example of something where people recognized there was a problem. It wasn't that big of a problem. Maybe you're right about that. It was allowed to fester, which on its own probably wasn't that big of a deal. But if you accumulate enough of these kinds of things, there becomes a bigger issue.
Yeah, and I mean, it was a very big deal for the people for whom it was a problem.
Right.
And, political science tells you that has the risk of eventually coming back to bite you. And, trade as a perceived problem, although you and I both agree that trade is not nearly as much of an actual problem as it is a perceived problem. But trade is a perceived problem, and a problem that it was perceived nobody cared enough to spend any political capital to do anything about.
Fair.
So here we are. But I gotta say, with everything else that's going on, I do not have the heart to argue with you much more about that. But what I feel like there's probably at least one. We should at least mention that there was there's a rumored executive order lifting sanctions on Russia.
Oh, Christ, yes. Okay.
And that, I mean, it's hard to over or underreact to something that you don't know what the actual content is.
Yes.
But the idea that the President of the United States, who said he was going to come in office and make better deals, and that his predecessors were the worst deal maker, and his opponent were the worst deal makers ever, and that he would come into office and lift sanctions without getting anything for them. I mean, I didn't go to the Harvard program on negotiation. I'm not like a trained professional, but you don't usually give away your biggest card for nothing up front.
It's
right?
not just, more than that, what I don't understand is it's not just that it's not obvious to me what you would get from Russia out of this deal. What would be very clear to me is that what you would get out of this deal is just a tremendous, disruption in relations with the European Union. If you do this...
I'm not even sure I agree with that, to be honest, because
Really?
you have enough countries in the EU that were being dragged against the will of their Russia-dependent business elites, and you have the French elections, the German elections, the Dutch elections, all of which Russian money is a huge problem. So I wish it were the case. I mean, yes, the Poles and the Balts are going to be hysterical, but
it's not just that; it's the unilateral move by the Trump administration to lift the sanctions. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. That in some ways, that's the very problem. Sanctions were a far more contentious issue within the European Union than they were in the United States, justifiably so, because Europe trades 10 times as much with Russia as the United States does. If the Trump administration lifts the sanctions unilaterally without any consultation whatsoever with the European Union, and if it does so particularly after presumably Theresa May is here telling Trump not to do that, because I think that's one of the few things that she said that, clearly don't do that, then you manage to, essentially give a black eye to the prime minister who has flown across the Atlantic to meet with you, and presumably, with an outstretched arm. You've managed to undercut the European Union, which, to be fair, I guess the Trump people don't mind that, because one of the unspoken issues of the Trump administration is their unremitting hostility to the European Union as a foreign policy actor. But yeah, to get back to your point, I don't see what the hell this gains us in terms of dealings with Russia, and it's not obvious to me what it's not obvious to me at all what gain you get in this deal from warmer relations with Russia, except maybe on Syria, and even there, I'm not sure it's really anything that tangibly benefits the United States.
Well, what you get is some gains for some particular corporate sectors. Let's be clear about that. There are segments of the American economy, ExxonMobil being one of them, that were hurt significantly when the U.S. implemented sanctions, and that we'll be very happy to see them go. So there are some clients for this decision.
Yeah, but even there, the economic benefits are really meager with lifting the sanctions.
I didn't say there were economic benefits to the country as a whole.
Okay. No, Dan, that's fair.
So just one other to branch. So again, that is a huge deal because it walks away from some core conventions of how you do business in the world. One being you don't do that kind of thing without consulting with your allies in the EU, and number two is you don't give away something for nothing to a country that is unrelentingly hostile to you in a number of sectors. So again, how much were the sanctions constraining Russia? That's not hugely clear. How much are the sanctions constraining Russia as opposed to how much is the rotation of U.S. troops through Eastern Europe constraining Russia? Interesting question. But again, the moving away from sort of a structure of how we do business in the world that has actually served us really well. And I'll just add, this will be, you'll be watching this after Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, has come and gone. But she basically comes here with two black eyes, self-inflicted or Trump-inflicted black eyes. She's already asked the administration not to lift the Russia sanctions unilaterally. She also, to her credit, came out and said very bluntly the UK won't partner with the US if the US tortures.
Right.
Which was a very brave thing for a British Prime Minister whose voters have just cut her off from the European Union. The Brits really, a post-Brexit Britain really needs the relationship with the U.S., and to take as firm a stand as she did on torture was impressive. It'll be important to watch, I think, what gets said by both sides after the meeting and what gets leaked about what the tone and content of it was. So If you're watching this and you haven't followed that, go back and check it out because it'll be interesting.
Well, and I would close with this observation, which you probably share, which is to say that as a political scientist, one of the great things about this new administration is the whole bevy of natural experiments we are about to experience as to whether, if you have an administration that radically changes the way it does things, do these changes actually matter both in terms of the health of the U.S. economy, the stability of the international system, so on and so forth. And one of the things that I am quite sure, based on just the first week of reporting alone, is that there will be leaks galore from this White House and from this administration, because it is very clear that you have a White House staff that, if not is exactly at each other's throats, certainly there are many different contending sources of power. And one of the ways they are going to try to influence things that go on, because they know Trump reads these things, is to leak them to the press and or leak them to CNN or Fox or MSNBC. And then on top of that, you are going to have the permanent bureaucracy, which is also probably going to leak like a sieve if they are being asked to do things that they think are contrary to the interests of the United States.
Led by our intelligence establishment, which is leaking like a sieve. And we should, as a small addendum to that, a smaller natural experiment that we are conducting is how a concerned citizen can keep track of all of this crazy. And we enjoy playing our small part in helping focus folks' attention on what's going on and what really matters. So, as we enter I think this is we're into our second decade of Blogging Heads. So we look forward to conducting this experiment with you, fellow citizens.
Yes, along with all the other foreign policy podcasts, even though ours is best.
Right.
Okay.
See you next time.
See you next time. Take care. Bye.